Hello? Okay, now it's working. I have no idea what happened. My mic setting reset for some reason, even though there wasn't any update, I think. At any rate, hello. Good morning. Time for some more food history. Like, hmm. How about some beef tea? Y'all want some beef tea? Victorian beef tea from a hospital. Oh wait, this guy. Nope, go away. Back off. You get no ad time here. Good day.
Usually have an option of black tea or green tea, sometimes white tea if it's a fancy place, but back in Victorian England you had the option of beef tea, the ideal beverage for the infirm and convalescing. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we tea some beef, this time on drinking history. So the first time I ever came across beef tea was when I was researching a video on Civil War hospital food. And it seems that during the 19th century, hospitals made a lot of beef tea. So it has been on my to-do list for quite some time, and some time is here. But as I looked for a recipe to actually make, I was kind of like, these are really, really simple because basically every recipe is just take beef, put it in water, boil it, and drink the water. That's beef tea. Once in a while, they would put the beef in a jar and submerge that in water and just let the juice kind of concentrate, and then you would dilute it with water to make beef tea. But I finally found a recipe that is ever so slightly more complicated, and it comes from one of Victorian England's celebrity chefs, Alexis Soyer, in his 1851 cookbook, The Modern Housewife, or Ménagère. Soyer's new way of making beef tea. Cut a pound of solid beef into very small dice, which put into a stew pan with a small pat of butter, a clove, 2 button onions, and a saltspoon of salt. Stir the meat round over the fire for a few minutes until it produces a thin gravy. Then add a quart of water and let it simmer at the corner of the fire for half an hour, skimming off every particle of fat. When done, pass through a sieve. I have always had a great objection to passing broth through a cloth, as it frequently quite spoils its flavor. So is it more complicated than all of the other beef tea recipes? Yes, but still pretty simple because it's basically just strained beef broth. So to make it, what you'll need is 1 pound or 450 grams of beef, and you want the least fatty beef that you can find so there's less skimming. 2 tablespoons of butter, 1 single clove, 2 pearl onions, a quarter teaspoon of salt, and 1 quart or 1 liter of water. So first, cut your beef into, as he says, very small dice, which is where we actually get the term diced, like diced meat or diced vegetables. That's where we get it. Then toss those into a pot along with the butter, the clove, the 2 small onions, and the salt. Then set that over medium heat and let it cook for a couple of minutes as the meat releases its juices. As it mixes with the melting butter, it should come to resemble a very thin gravy, and here you can pour in the water. Let the pot come to a simmer, then reduce the heat so it is just barely simmering, and set the lid on and let it simmer for 30 minutes. Now the recipe says that you want to skim off all of the fat as it's simmering. That is easier said than done. I tried, I got some. There is an easier way to do this, which we will get to later on. So let the broth simmer on low for 30 minutes, then remove it from the heat and set up a strainer over a pot and pour the liquid through the strainer. Now a lot of the recipes from this period have you strain it through a tammy cloth or another type of cloth, and you will get more of the particles out, but Soyer is specific in saying that he finds that that ruins the flavor, so I am just using a mesh strainer. Once strained, you can set it aside to cool, and once it's cooled, it will be easier to skim off the fat. In fact, you can even put it in the refrigerator to speed up that process, and you'll get more of the fat off of the top. And then at this point, you're probably asking, well, what do I do with all that beef that's left over? Well, a lot of writings from the time actually say that it's basically useless at this point because all of the nutrients have been sucked out into the beef tea, so it can be like used for dog food or something like that. But that's not true, and a lot of people then knew that's not true. There is still a lot of nutrients left in the beef, so you can actually turn it into like pies, meat pies and stuff like that. Or one recipe from Isabella Beeton, who wrote Victorian England's most popular cookbook, she gives an alternative way to use the leftover meat. And she actually quotes Soyer's recipe. She makes some changes to it, giving us more specifics like exactly how much butter and stuff to use. But at the end of the recipe, she says the meat left from beef tea may be boiled a little longer and pounded with spices, etc. for potting. It makes a very nice breakfast dish. Potted meat is a way of preserving meat, usually kind of by hashing it or making it very, very small, and then packing it tightly into a jar and pouring fat over it. And once the fat solidifies, it is, in theory, airtight and will preserve it for longer. So if you want to do that, by all means, do so as I tell you a bit more about the history of beef tea.
My question is, why in the first place would you make beef tea? Like, who in their right mind would think, you know what, let's boil some beef and make it into tea, a drink? I mean, really.
Beef tea, or versions of it by other names, goes at least back to the Renaissance. In Bartolomeo Scapi's 1570 cookbook, he has a section of
The Renaissance? I was thinking like some poor British people were like doing this to stave off hunger, like poor British peasants. I guess I was wrong.
recipes for the sick, and this included several chicken broths and a couple recipes for veal broth. They were flavored with cinnamon, vinegar, and wine, but essentially, the veal broth is a fancy version of beef tea. But beef tea by that name doesn't really appear until the mid-18th century.
Again, he has a different, like, Pokemon plush sitting on this stand over here, like, every video.
And it's
Just an observation.
kind of a home remedy for all sorts of ills. As my grandpa used to say, it'll cure what ails ya. He didn't say that about beef tea, he said it about other things, but still, same concept. Though it wasn't always as a drink. In 1784, the Scottish physician William Buchan suggested that when a woman is in childbirth, you should give her light food. But when the stomach will not bear any kind of nourishment, the patient may be supported for some time by the clysters of beef tea or chicken water. A clyster being an enema. And it is a little disturbing that this is actually the second time enemas have come up on this program in the last 2 months. If you watch the video on Kellogg's Corn Flakes, you'll know all about that, and it's even more disturbing. But worry not, I will be drinking this beef tea. Now, just as it was good for women giving birth, it was also good for the baby post-birth. Now, the idea was that a wet nurse would feed the baby with milk. But a nurse who has not milk enough is apt to imagine that this defect may be supplied by giving the child wines, cordial waters, and other strong liquors. This is an egregious mistake. The only thing that has any chance to supply the place of the nurse's milk must be somewhat nearly of the same quality as cow's milk or beef tea with a little bread. It never can be done by the help of strong liquors. I just love that in 1807, liquor was considered even an option by some people to replace mother's milk. I've heard of people saying this gin or whiskey tastes like mother's milk, but I always thought that was an expression. Anyway, by the 19th century, this beef tea had really become the drink to have if you were ill or convalescing at home. Almost all of the cookbooks from this period have at least one recipe for beef tea, often in sections with recipes specifically for invalids. And since, during the 19th century, it seems that everyone was sick all the time, beef tea became a common drink to have in the households of both America, England, and all over Europe, provided you had the money to produce it, because it took a lot of time and it took a lot of beef, which was an expensive product. So, beef tea quickly became the ideal candidate for commercial production.
Welcome to the PetSmart Kitchen.
No ad time here, go away.
The Bavarian chemist Justus von Liebig. He was interested in the chemistry of food. He's the person who emphasized adding nitrogen and minerals to fertilizer, invented one of the first baby formulas, and he is the person that we can thank for spreading around that felonious idea that searing meat locks in the juices. It does not. But in 1840, he came up with a way of extracting the essence from beef, and it took 30 pounds of beef to make 1 pound of beef extract. And in 1865, he established Liebig's Extract of Meat Company in Fray Bentos, Uruguay. Being produced in Uruguay was much less expensive because they had a flourishing leather market, and so beef was simply an inexpensive byproduct of that production. Now, his product was not beef tea, but when it was mixed with water, it would become a substitute for beef tea. But it wasn't just water. It could be mixed with Madeira, sherry, or port wine, or the yolk of a fresh egg, or a trifle of fresh butter, or some bread, or a boiled potato. A slight addition of Worcestershire sauce is liked by many. And it was good at all times of day. It was good for your breakfast, but also it could be added to your soups or sauces and other dishes, or as a nightcap. This beef tea soothes and settles the stomach, allays brain excitement, and induces sleep. And both Liebig's Extract of Meat and homemade beef tea had big proponents, including Alexis Soyer, whose recipe we're making today, and Florence Nightingale, hero of the Crimean War and founder of modern nursing. But even with big names behind it, beef tea and beef extract did
surprising,
have its detractors.
Florence Nightingale.
One 1874 article decried the uselessness of beef tea. Chambers Journal says many persons believe that beef tea is very nourishing and is an excellent strengthener for people of weak health. This is a mistake. And in 1865, the New York Times, quoting the Pall Mall Gazette, talked about just how much beef was being wasted in its production. The waste of beef in making beef tea is enormous. 62,000 pounds a year are used in one London hospital alone. At the present price of meat, this is a very serious matter. It is Liebig's theory that in beef tea, properly made, you get all the nutritive part of the beef. The British Medical Journal, on the other hand, asserts that a dog fed on beef tea dies as soon as one who gets nothing but mere water. They go on to suggest that should you really want to get the nutrients of the beef, then after drinking the beef tea, you should eat the remaining beef that's left over, which kind of defeats the purpose, seeing as it's for people who can't digest the solid beef. And they admit that and kind of say, hey, here's another alternative. You could use more wine and less beef tea in fever cases and the like. Wine by itself will support life for a very long time. Wine by all means for the sick poor as well as for the sick rich. But the mob had spoken, and it was in favor of beef tea.
To improve health, drink some wine, apparently.
And with the commercial success of Liebig's extract of meat, there were other companies getting in, trying to capitalize on this new concentrated form of beef. One of the most famous was a Scottish butcher who was living in Canada. He had been given the job of producing a shelf-stable beef extract with which to supply the French army during the Franco-Prussian War. And in 1871, he introduced fluid beef. A brilliant new product with an absolutely horrible name. Fluid beef. Gross. And that's why when he moved to England in the 1880s, he changed the name to Bovril. Bovril became incredibly popular in the UK at the end of the Victorian era, and was even used by the British Army, who used it in the same way that they used dried meat in their field rations. It was part of the ration in the Second Boer War and in World War I. And while homemade beef tea lost favor in the subsequent years, Bovril continued and continues to be sold in the UK and other parts of the world. Meat extracts aren't so popular today in the US, but they did have their heyday in the early 20th century. They, along with beef tea, are mentioned in Fanny Farmer's Food and Cookery for the Sick and Convalescent, though she says that homemade beef tea is definitely preferable to the commercial extracts that were on the market. And while, like the nurses before her, she does suggest that it can be used for those who are sick, she cautions it is never safe to resort to beef tea as the principal article of diet for more than a few days, as it would mean slow starvation to the patient. One place I did not expect to find beef tea cropping up, but I sure did, was in a cocktail book. Actually, numerous cocktail books of the early 20th century. Like in 1917's The Ideal Bartender, there is a recipe for beef tea made with pepper, salt, and celery salt with a side of ice. Can you imagine going into a bar today and ordering a tall glass of beef tea? No, I don't think you could. Though a lot of those ingredients are actually available for the Bloody Mary, so it's just the beef that you would need. But having beef tea in bars was actually a thing early on, and in the 1960s, Campbell's Soup seems to have tried to bring it back. In the early 1960s, Campbell's came up with an ad campaign for Soup on the Rocks, where you would chill a glass of beef broth and then drink it up. They said you could take it straight or add a dash of Worcestershire or lemon peel for a kicky switch. And with only 16 calories a serving, they said it was ideal for dieters. Then if you wanted something a little more elevated, they advertised the Frisky Sour, the greatest drink since Soup on the Rocks, the brightest, beefiest drink of the year. Mix Campbell's beef broth, 2 cans chilled, 1 can of ice water, 1/3 cup fresh lemon juice. Shake, enjoy.
Why? Why did Campbell's think this was a good idea? Fucking beef broth cocktails. Oh my god. No way.
No, I don't think I will. I've never really wanted a cocktail that was known as beefy. And yet, my beef tea should be about ready to drink, so here we go. So once your beef tea has cooled, it's much easier to skim the fat off the top. Then it can be reheated and it's ready to drink. And here we are, Victorian beef tea. So I put it into this glass just so you could kind of see what it looks like. It is murky, it's not clear. If you put it through a cloth, it would have been clearer. And and it's very light in color. If you make it using like beef extract, like Bovril or something, usually it's darker. But this whole recipe, light beef tea. Here we go. It smells like beef bouillon. That's actually really nice.
What?
That's like, on a cold evening, that would be wonderful to have. I mean, does it taste like tea? No, not at all, because there's no like tea leaves in it. But it also doesn't taste like bouillon or beef stock or something like that. It's much lighter in flavor. It's not really beefy. It's more, I mean, you just get a hint of it. There's like this kind of savoriness, but there's also, it's unctuous, like it coats the tongue, because even though we've skimmed off the fat, there is still fat in there. That's actually really nice. So I don't think that you could just swap this out for like bouillon or something like that. It's not the same, especially if you were making it like with a bouillon cube. It's not the same because there is a texture to this that you're not going to get with any kind of soup product. It is different. And so yeah, that is beef tea. And I'm going to put that recipe up on the Tasting History website. Also, make sure you are signed up for the Tasting History newsletter, which you'll do so by going to tastinghistory.com, a website that I made with help from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes building a website so easy with their...
What the hell? It's actually apparently good. No fucking way it was actually good. Fucking beef tea. Oh yeah, he mentioned cornflakes from 1895. Disturbing origin. Alright, you have my attention, good sir.
So?
Nope, go away.
Famous names in the history of breakfast is John Harvey Kellogg, who made it his life's mission to heal the minds and bodies of America, albeit through some weird, even sadistic practices at times, including electroshock therapy and yogurt enemas. But one of the more tame curatives he promoted, and probably his most lasting legacy, was the invention of cornflakes, the breakfast cereal which I'll attempt to make using instructions from the original patent. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as I attempt to make the true cornflakes, this time on Tasting History.
The fact was that about yogurt enemas?
Now, in determining how I was going to make these original cornflakes, I looked to the patent from 1895, which is probably the earliest recipe for making these cornflakes. Now, it's very, very long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here are the bullet points. Patent number 558393 for flaked cereals and process of preparing same. First, soak the grains for some hours, say 8 to 12. Second, cook the grain thoroughly. For this purpose, it should be boiled in water for about an hour. Third, after boiling, the grain is then cooled and partially dried, then passed through cold rollers. The purpose of this process of rolling is to flatten the grain into extremely thin flakes, whereby the bran is broken into small particles. Fourth, after rolling the compressed grain of flakes, it is then baked or roasted in an oven until dry and crisp. And the patent doesn't just apply to corn. He says it could be corn or barley or wheat. In fact, I think wheat was the first thing that they used. But this is kind of where my dilemma is, because he talks about putting the entire grain or wheat berry or piece of corn through the roller to make it into a flake. And that description agrees with something that William Kellogg later wrote, saying that it came out in the form of large thin flakes, each individual wheat berry forming one flake. But in other descriptions, he talks about making it into a dough, which would require the grain to be broken up before putting it into the roller, so not entirely sure what was going on in that very first process, so I'm going to try both and see which works best. Now, what is definite about that original 1895 version is that there was exactly one ingredient: corn or wheat or whatever grain you were using. There was no sugar, no salt, no nothing. It was bland, and it was supposed to be bland because Dr. John Harvey Kellogg said that the most bland plain foods were the most healthful. So for this recipe, I got 2.5 pounds or about 1 kilogram of corn. And Dr. Kellogg did say that it is the corn that was used in hominy grits, so it's a larger kernel rather than the small sweet corn, which might taste better, but I tried it and it makes for some teeny tiny flakes. So take the corn and cover it with water and soak it for about 12 hours. Now, Dr. Kellogg says that this should either be in cold water or hot water above 110 degrees so that it doesn't start to ferment. And so you can keep it in really hot water. I'm not exactly sure how you would do that. Or you can just do like I did and put it in the fridge overnight. So hot or cold, either one works, just like it works for coffee. Hot coffee and cold coffee, which you can get from today's sponsor, Trade. Trade is a coffee subscription service that delivers freshly roasted coffee of cold coffees and cold drink. Nice and mild with a bit of cream, just how I like it. That's drinktrade.com/MaxMiller to sign up and get a free bag of coffee. And they guarantee that you'll love your first bag or they'll replace it for free. Now back to the cornflakes.
Okay.
So once your corn is nice and soaked, the patent says that it should be boiled. So drain the corn and add it to a pot, then fill it with water and bring it to a boil. Cover it up and boil for 1 hour or until it's nice and soft, and make sure to give it a stir every few minutes just to make sure it's not sticking to the bottom of the pot. Then once it's cooked, drain it again and leave it to cool and dry. And here's where I began testing different ways to recreate this recipe, because the patent talks about how each grain or kernel is supposed to turn into one flake. And they had these rollers that they would put them through that would mash them into a flake, and then they would scrape them off. I don't have those rollers. They're like industrial rollers, so I tried a few different things. One, I tried to put it through a pasta roller. That did not work, and I almost broke my pasta roller. I tried rolling them out with a rolling pin. Not really, so I ended up just kind of mashing them, and it did make it into a flake, but then when I baked them, it really just turned into kind of like smashed popcorn. I don't think that's right. So with almost an entire day of different versions all not working out, I decided I would have to go with a dough. So I put the corn into a food processor and ground it up. Not nearly as fine as cornmeal, but fine enough that when I added a little water, I got something resembling a dough that I could at least roll out fairly thin. So I put that into the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius, and toasted it for 15 minutes or until it was nice and crispy. Again, I know this is not going to look like the original version, but since the only ingredient is corn, it should at least taste like the original version. Now, before we finish up the recipe, we need to talk about something, and that is a story that has been going around on the internet for many years, saying that Kellogg's Corn Flakes were invented to stop people from pleasuring themselves. And while it is true that John Harvey Kellogg was obsessed with what he called the secret sin, claiming that the solitary vice made boys pale, scrawny, hollow-eyed, dull, and listless, and could lead to bad eyesight and even psychotic behavior, and while it is true that he had a lot of ways of dealing with this secret sin, including extreme pain to the region or just locking it up in a cage, it seems that making cornflakes was not one of these treatments. Rather, cornflakes was a way to get people to chew their food more and to just help with indigestion. Now, is that as exciting of a headline? No, it's not. But I promise you, the story of cornflakes is still really, really cool.
Yeah, that's...
While today we associate the name Kellogg with breakfast cereal, in the last decades of the 19th century, Kellogg's was synonymous with good health. As director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was a health guru of the age. He published numerous books and pamphlets, all filled with ways to keep both your mind and body healthy. And so you had people like President William Howard Taft, Henry Ford, Amelia Earhart, and Thomas Edison all converging on Battle Creek to be healed via the treatments of Dr. Kellogg. Now, some of the treatments were pretty tame, things that you wouldn't bat an eye at today. Things like daily exercise, getting a good night's sleep, and a low-fat vegetarian diet of whole grains and other fiber-rich foods. foods. And this
Okay.
was his cure for one of the most common maladies of the day, and that was bad indigestion. And when you look at the cookbooks of the late 19th century, you see that a lot of the food was like meat and gravy and cream sauce, so it's no wonder that people had a lot of indigestion. For things like seasonal depression, he prescribed light therapy or phototherapy. He also did things like thermotherapy, where he would subject you to rather extreme bouts of cold, and electroshock therapy, which, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. But these were all some of the more tame treatments that he had, and definitely
Tame?
not what he would become infamous for. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, one of his more infamous treatments was thrice daily enemas. And you could either have a yogurt enema, where you would eat a half pint of yogurt and then have the other half pint entered through a different hole, or a traditional water enema, but the water was pumped into you via a machine that he invented that pumped 15 liters of water per minute. That's a lot of water. He also used a number of machines that were meant to massage the bowels to get things moving, but they were vigorous massages, rather painful. He even had a slapping machine, which would literally slap the out of you. And it, again, was very painful and was meant to be, because pain was one of the ways that you could treat a lot of the mental issues that you might be having.
What the hell?
That was especially true if he thought that the root of your issue was sex. And frankly, he believed that the root of pretty much all people's issues was sex. Now, best in his mind was to abstain from it altogether, which is what he and his wife of 4 decades did, having never ever consummated their marriage. And many of these beliefs stemmed from his version of the Seventh-day Adventist religion, which also informed many of his beliefs on diet. He often cites his personal religious views, which sometimes conflicted with the official views of the church, when discussing his views on diet, including complete abstention from meat, tobacco, alcohol, coffee, chocolate, or caffeine of any kind. Instead, he believed that a diet of grains and vegetables was the best way to keep a person healthy, both in mind and body. It was also important that this food that you were eating was very well chewed. And he got these ideas from someone who was dubbed the Great Masticator.
Ralph's brings you big flavor and big.
Alright, feck off. No ad time here. Go away.
Who, along with trying out a diet of nothing but potatoes for 58 days, also popularized Fletcherism. And this was a system that dictated what to eat, when to eat, and how to eat it, meaning how many times you needed to chew something before swallowing it. Usually this was 32 to 50 times, but there were foods that required more, and he said you should just stay away from them. Things like the shallot. When you eat a shallot, you're supposed to chew 720 times before swallowing. That's about 10 minutes of chewing before swallowing. Now, Dr. Kellogg
Hey,
took Fletcher's
what now?
advice to heart and required all of his patients at the sanitarium to chew their food at least 40 times. And whilst they chewed, he sang a song, which started, "Chew, chew, chew, that is the thing to do. You may smile when you chew, but don't try to talk too, for perhaps you will choke and be sorry that you spoke." And it was this combination of a grain-heavy diet and the need to chew your food that birthed cornflakes. Now, cornflakes were not strictly the first breakfast cereal. That had been invented in 1863 by Dr. James Caleb Jackson. At his own sanitarium in New York, he had invented something called granula, and this was basically graham bread that was baked and dried to within an inch of its life, much like hardtack. This was then broke into little pieces and put in milk and left to soak overnight, though even after a night of soaking, it was supposed to be as hard as pebbles. And so this was the perfect food for Dr. Kellogg, he thought, so he basically just copied it, but instead of calling it granula, he called it granola, so he didn't get in any legal issues. Now, granola
Of
was
course.
incredibly
Legal
flavorless
issues.
and incredibly popular. His patients loved it, and he loved giving it to his patients. But it required a lot of chewing, so much so that it actually broke a woman's tooth at one point, and so he was on the lookout for something that wouldn't
Oh my
require
God.
as much chewing. Then he came across a man who had invented another new cereal, which was tasteless, difficult to chew, and like eating a whisk broom. The tasteless and whisk broom were great. Difficult to chew, not great. But something about it worked for him, because what it was wheat that was made into a sort of slurry and then pushed into little threads, kind of like a pasta extruder, and those threads would then be put together into like a little basket. And this was shredded wheat. Well, Kellogg wanted to buy the rights to shredded wheat, but he couldn't get them, and so he decided, well, I'll just make my own version, but I'll make it even easier to chew by making it into a flake. And this is where John's brother William enters the story. Except that actually William's been there the whole time. You just haven't noticed him because he has been in Dr. Kellogg's shadow the entire time. Basically, he has been his assistant and lackey for decades and has been made to do all sorts of things, not just taking notes and writing letters, but polishing his brother's white shoes and trimming his beard. It wasn't uncommon for William to work 120 hours a week and originally got $9 a week, which is like $275 in modern money. So now we have the two Kellogg brothers and John's wife, Ella, testing ways to make this grain into flaked cereal. And they test it for months. And finally, they figure out that if they soak the grain and boil it and then push it through these rollers and scrape it off, it comes out as flakes. And that is the version that is then patented. They call these flakes Granos, and in 1895 they start serving them at the sanitarium, either plain or sometimes in milk or yogurt, which I guess is a better way of getting your yogurt than via enema. The brothers also began selling Granos to former patients, shipping it out via mail order, and eventually they just had too much Granos to make, and so Will asked his brother if they could build a small factory, and in 1897 they opened up the Sanitas Food Company, which began selling toasted cornflakes soon after. A much better name than Granos, if you ask me, though they did not change the formula because Dr. Kellogg said that they should remain bland and tasteless because they were a health food. The problem was, while some people enjoyed cereal because of its health benefits, a lot of people in the country were wanting to have cold cereal because it was just easier than making breakfast. Hot porridges could take hours and hours to make, whereas breakfast cereal, put it in a bowl, you're ready to go. Well, William saw this potential and was like, we got to change up the formula so we can get this into more households. But John said, absolutely not. We are not changing it. It's going to remain bland. And this left a big void in the cold cereal market for others to come in and fill. And one of those people was a former patient of Dr. Kellogg, a man named Charles Post. Post opened a factory also in Battle Creek where he produced a cereal based on Kellogg's granola, but he made the pieces much smaller and he added sugar, and he called it Grape Nuts. Over the next few years, Post and numerous others turned Battle Creek into a cereal Silicon Valley with dozens of cereal factories opening all over. Everyone was making money, everyone except William Kellogg, because by now he was pretty much running the cereal factory, except that his brother John was still calling all of the shots. Time and again, he asked his brother if they could change up the formula or at least start a national advertising campaign, and time and again, his brother said no. He didn't want to change anything. He saw it as a health food, and he didn't want his reputation tarnished. But one day, while John was on a trip to Europe, William decided to go rogue. He added salt, malt, and sugar, and people loved it, but not John. John hated it, and when he came back, he said, "How dare you mess with my food? Change it back." Well, William saw that he had made the right decision in changing the recipe, but John was never going to change his mind. And so he decided, you know what, I'm done, and he quit. And he decided he was going to take cornflakes and make them work on his own. but John owned most of the rights still, and he thwarted his brother at every turn. So after 6 months,
Wow.
William came back. And the reason that he came back was because the sanitarium burned down to the ground. And he saw that his brother needed help, and so he returned to his shadows to help him rebuild. And William was the financial brains in the family, so he was able to get the funds and rebuild the sanitarium bigger and better than it had been before. And you'd think that John would be grateful, but he wasn't. And what really must have stung was in the 3 years that they were rebuilding, William had to look just down the street to see Charles Post making money hand over fist making cereal. But after the sanitarium was rebuilt, William had a bit of a nest egg, but John did not. He had gone way into debt to rebuild the sanitarium, and William knew this. And so he used that against John, saying, "Hey, I know you need money. I will buy the rights to cornflakes from you." Well, John did not like this, but he needed the money, and so eventually he gave up the rights, and William made a clean break, and in 1906 opened a new factory for the new Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. Now, William had several setbacks fairly early on. First, Charles Post started selling a new cereal that was basically cornflakes, but he called it Post Toasties. And the new cornflakes factory burned down. But despite these setbacks, the business actually flourished, namely due to the fact that William was excellent at marketing. He knew right away that people just needed to taste cornflakes to become customers. And so he started a national campaign that was a little risque for the time, that encouraged women to give the grocer a wink and see what you'll get. And what you would get, of course, would be a sample of cornflakes for free. It actually went so well, though, that just 6 months later, he had to change the campaigns to stop winking. So Will's cereal company was flourishing, and John's sanitarium was also flourishing. And surely they could be happy for each other and let bygones be bygones.
No.
Right? No. Instead, they sued each other over the rights to the name Kellogg when it came to cereal. And for 10 years, they battled in the courts.
Damn.
John claimed that he was the first to use Kellogg for a cereal, which he was, and he was the famous Kellogg. He was the doctor that everyone knew. But William said that he had basically turned Kellogg's into the country's biggest cereal producer and made the name a household name synonymous with cereal. And after 10 years, the courts sided with him, and so he changed the company's name in 1922 to the Kellogg Cereal Company. And from that point on, the brothers' fortunes really began to diverge. Will's company flourished, as we all know Kellogg's. But John's sanitarium began to lose popularity. Partly it was because his methods of healing kind of went by the wayside, and he really started focusing on like eugenics and forced sterilization. Things got dark. But also, the Great Depression hit, and people just couldn't afford the luxury of the sanitarium. And so eventually, it did go into bankruptcy. And this is when John wrote a note to William. It was going to ask for money, but it was also a letter of reconciliation, a letter of apology for not just how they ended things, but all the decades of abuse that he had put upon his little brother. But there was no reconciliation because the letter never got to William, or at least didn't get there right then. Because while John dictated the letter, it was his assistant who wrote it down. And she felt that it was beneath her employer's dignity to apologize in such a manner. And so instead of sending the letter, she put it into a filing cabinet. And there it sat for 8 years, long after John had died. And they never really reconciled. They had met once and it did not go well. Anyway, it wasn't for 8 years until somebody finally found this letter and gave it to William. But by then, it was too late. A sad end to the relationship.
That was a
of these
dick
two
move
brothers
by the
who,
secretary.
in 1895, kicked off the cold cereal craze with cornflakes. The cornflakes that should be ready. So after 15 minutes, the dough should be well toasted, and you can break them up into little flakes, and they're ready to eat. And here we are, the original cornflakes from 1895. Sort of. They should taste like them, even though the process didn't quite nail it. One of these days I'll get those rollers. Anyway, like you said, I could eat them plain, and you know what? I will try one plain. Crispy.
Seems like a corn chip
Bland.
at this point.
As they're supposed to be. But it tastes like a cornflake. The flavor is the same. It's just missing that little extra something, that extra something being sugar. But I wanted to put some milk on them just to see how it goes. And see if they maybe soften up a little bit. I'm sure eventually they will, but we don't have time to wait for my cereal to get soggy. So here we go. That's actually pretty good. Again, it tastes like cornflakes, just not quite as sweet. Add a little sugar in there, you got yourself some nice cereal. So would I recommend making these? No, I would not. It is way too much work the way that I did it.
Just buy
Just
from
not
the
worth
store.
it. If you do want to make them, if you want to make your own though, just buy some like cornmeal, some stone ground cornmeal, and use that. Add a little sugar, add a little salt, and then bake them that way. And if you add a little bit more water, I think you can make an even finer flake. And if you have industrial rollers at home, then let me know how the original process goes.
If you have industrial
Get some
rollers
industrial
at
rollers. Anyway, don't forget to try some cold brew or other coffee at Trade, and I will see you next time.
Damn. Still all that beef between the two brothers. And then like the older brother is like, you know what, I'm gonna try and like, apologize to him. And then the dick secretary is like, nah, you don't need to do that. I'm just gonna put this letter here. Cowboy pork and beans, biscuits and gravy. Gold Rush miners. The bread of Ramses III. D-Day breakfast. Luxury dining on the Lusitania before it sunk. Waffles and wine. Medieval tavern meal. Ooh. Oregon Trail breakfast. Feasts of the Samurai. Hot chocolate from 1747. Eating at the Colosseum. The original potato chip. Alright, you have my attention, sir.
The $7 look.
You do not have my attention, Taco Bell.
Found on the internet that says potato chips were invented near Saratoga Springs, New York in 1853. It's even on the website of the Smithsonian, so it's gotta be true, right? Wrong, and I am going to prove it by making a recipe for potato chips from 1817, 36 years before the story took place. The history, both fake and real, of the potato chip. This time on Tasting History.
Alright. Let's see what lies we've been told.
So the recipe that I'm working from today to dispel the spurious claim that the potato chip was invented in 1853 comes from The Cook's Oracle, an 1817 English cookbook by Dr. William Kitchener. Now the American term chip nor the British term crisp had come into common use yet, so he calls them potatoes fried in slices or shavings. Peel large potatoes, slice them about 1/4 inch thick or cut them in shavings round and round as you would peel a lemon. Dry them well in a clean cloth and fry them in lard or dripping. Take care that your fat and frying pan are quite clean. Put it on a quick fire, watch it, and as soon as the lard boils and is still, put in the slices of potato and keep moving them till they are crisp. Take them up and lay them to drain on a sieve. Send them up with very little salt sprinkled over them. So he says they should be about 1/4 inch thick, which is a lot thicker than you would make a potato chip today, but nowhere near as thick as you would make like a French fry or what they would call a chip in England. Another way that they're different from French fries is he says they should be crisp, and French fries aren't usually crisp, especially if you're in England. Frankly, they make soggy fries. So I'm curious, is this the origin of the English term crisp, meaning potato chip? I don't know. Either way, I am going to make these 1/4 of an inch thick and 1/8 of an inch thick, which is what later recipes call for from the mid to late 19th century. So for this recipe, all you need is a few potatoes, about 1 pound, and you want to use either russet potatoes or any high starch potato. That's going to work best for this. And then about 2 quarts of lard. You can use any kind of oil. He mentions lard, but you can use a different type of oil if you would prefer, but lard tastes great, so that's what I'm using. Then just a bit of salt. So first, peel the potatoes and then slice them. You can use a knife for this, but you want them to be very, very even, so I'm going to be using a mandolin slicer. 1, because that's frankly the best way to slice potatoes evenly, and 2, it is something that they would have had available at the time. In fact, similar tools appear as far back as the Opera di Bartolomeo Scappi, and by the 18th century they were pretty much what we use today. And there's actually some fake history about the mandolin slicer also circulating around the internet. On some sites, you will find claims that it was invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, famous for another slicing device, the guillotine. And it would be really, really cool if that was true. When I first read that, I was like, oh, let this actually be a thing, but turns out it's not, or at least there is no evidence to suggest that it is, so oh well. Now this recipe is very simple. It says that you just slice the potatoes and then dry them and fry them. There is no mention of washing them or putting them in any kind of solution that will strip away some of the starch, which is the common method that is used today because it's going to allow you to leave them in the fryer longer before they get dark. But he doesn't say to do that, so I'm not doing that. So all I'm doing is slicing the potatoes and then drying them well and then heating up my fat. Now whatever fat you're using, you want to bring it up to around 365 degrees Fahrenheit or 185 Celsius before adding your potatoes. Once you've added the potatoes, they're going to bubble all about and the temperature of the oil is going to drop considerably, but that is okay. We actually want it to drop to between 240 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's actually where you want to keep it for most of the frying. And depending on the width of the potato slice, is going to depend on how long you need to fry it. They're really, really thin. 5 to 7 minutes is fine. My 1/4 of an inch thick potatoes, though, they needed about 15 minutes at that temperature. And the thing is, you kind of have to do this a little bit to know when they're done. A lot of the bubbles will stop bubbling, but there still will be some, and it will start to darken, but you got to kind of find that sweet spot. Also, in 1817, they wouldn't have had thermometers, so that too, just telling the temperature of the fat, that too would have had to been done just by doing it. Trial and error, baby. Now while they fry, the recipe says to keep moving them around. It doesn't need to be constant, but this will keep them from sticking and will allow them to fry more evenly. Now after they've had some time in that 240 to 250 range, you can raise the temperature up to close to 300, but don't go over 300. Then keep it there for about the last 5 minutes. This will help them really crisp up and get a little bit darker. And he says that they're ready once they are crisp. It is kind of hard to tell when they are crisp, but by stirring them around, you'll start to kind of feel the potato, and once they're not given any give, then they're crisp. Then take them out and set them on a large flat sieve like the recipe says, or you can just use some paper towel laid over a cooling rack. Essentially, all you're trying to do is let any excess grease drain. After a minute or so, sprinkle with a bit of salt and toss them and let them cool to room temperature. And while they cool, make sure you are subscribed to Tasting History as we look at the fake history of potato chips.
Fake history.
Saratoga Lake, New York, 1853. It all took place at Moon's Lake House, a fine establishment serving high-quality victuals to the muckety-mucks come up from New York City. Now, the restaurant itself was owned by a Mr. Carey Moon, but all the cooking was done by Catherine Wicks, affectionately known as Aunt Kate, and her brother, George Speck Crumb. So one version of the story goes that George is back in the kitchen when a well-to-do customer, sometimes the customer is Cornelius Vanderbilt in some versions, but a well-to-do customer comes in and orders some fried potatoes, which were on the menu. George fries up the potatoes, sends them out, and the customer says, no, they need to be thinner like I had in France. Ooh la la. So George slices them thinner, sends them out again, and once again, nope, not thin enough. Well, this goes on several times, depending on who's telling the tale, until finally George, fed up with this difficult customer, slices the potatoes so thin that you could even see through them, wafer thin. Then he fries them up, salts them, and sends them out to the customer, assuming that the customer would be embarrassed or upset at how silly these thin potatoes were. Well, the customer loved them and ate the whole basket or plate or whatever they were served on, just polished them off, and thus born was the potato chip. The first problem with this story is that, as evidenced by the recipe that we're making today, they already existed, both in an English cookbook and in several American cookbooks, like the Virginia Housewife from 1824, though that one pretty much just copied word for word the English recipe, so do with that what you will. Also, there are so many variations on this story, who the customer was, exactly when it was, even who was doing the cooking, because sometimes it was Aunt Kate, his sister, who sometimes is also his sister-in-law. It's an absolute mess. Anyway, there's so much variation that it's hard to actually say what happened. Also, the first time that any of this seemed to have been talked about or written down wasn't until 30 years after it supposedly took place. This is how fake history gets spread around. All of the internet,
What do you know?
published publications, of course it's published, it's publication. Anyway, it gets spread around, and so you just gotta always kind of find those original sources, and if you can't find them, well, maybe something's amiss. But even though the story, as was told, probably never happened, there is some truth to it, because George Crumb, who was very much a real person, was a very respected chef and later owned his own restaurant near Saratoga Springs, and he probably is the person to have either first made potato chips very, very thin, or at least he's the first person to have popularized them. This very thin style of chip became known as Saratoga chips. In 1883, Jessup Whitehead wrote in the Chicago Herald Cooking School that potatoes sliced thick are not Saratogas, though generally so called. The true chips are as thin as paper and curl up when fried. They are used cold.
Hello, Michael. How's it going? More food history today, including the fake and real history of potato chips. Earlier, we covered the unusual history of cornflakes, as well as... it's going alright. Well, of course, the obligatory hydrate. I got some coffee today. Nothing like a nice hot cup of joe in the morning. It's getting colder lately. But yeah, food history.
As well as hot, and may be prepared before wanted, and kept a considerable time. And by the end of the 19th century, this style of chip was very much associated with George Crumb and his restaurant. Not to dine at Crumb's at the lake is to be out of the world and out of the fashion. Crumb has owned the place for 10 years and has made a big success of it, and there first appeared to a waiting, hungry world the delectable morsels known as Saratoga chips. These Saratoga chips were incredibly popular, and by the late 19th century, there were recipes in many, many American cookbooks for them, and they were actually selling Saratoga chip slicers specially designed for slicing Saratoga chips, except that they weren't. They were actually just regular potato slicers, but they would say that they were specially designed for Saratoga chips because it sold more slicers. Then in 1895, William Tappenden of Ohio began boxing up the chips and selling them to stores. The only problem with that is that the chips would go stale rather quickly, the merest bit of humidity, and the chips are no longer crisp.
Whatever you do it for life.
Nope, go away. You get no ad time here. You got no ad time either.
came in 1926, when a California woman named Laura Scudder, famous now for her peanut butter, she debuted a bag of wax paper that could be filled with chips and then sealed. She even put a date of not expiration but of freshness on the bag, letting you know how long they would be nice and crisp. And she marketed them as Laura Scudder's potato chips, the noisiest chips in the world. And around this time, across
One
the
hell of
pond
a
in England,
tagline.
where instead of chips they had taken on the name Crisps, the Smith's Potato Crisps Company began selling the chips in grease-proof paper bags all over London. And with the bag of potato chips came a little sachet of salt so you could flavor the chips yourself. And that pretty much was the only flavor added to potato chips for the longest time. And it would take someone who really understood potatoes to take the chip to the next level in flavor. And of course, it would take an Irishman to do so. In 1954, a man named Seamus was working for the Tayto Irish Crisp Company, and under the direction of the owner, Joe Spud Murphy, they debuted a cheese and onion flavored chip. They took off and became wildly popular. Other companies started getting in on the game. Very soon, the flavor was followed by salt and vinegar, but in America, it was actually sour cream and onion and barbecue that became popular. Now, the main issue with these crisps or chips was that in the bag, they were so thin that they would often break up, and so you'd open the bag and really there'd just be a bunch of crumbs. And then two companies decided to address this issue. The first was in the 1950s with the corrugated potato chip, better known today as Ruffles. Ruffles have ridges. Does anyone else remember those commercials? It was like late 80s, early 90s. I'm dating myself.
I'm
Well,
not
it's
that
because
old.
of those ridges that the chips had more structural integrity and so were less prone to breakage. The other solution came in 1956 when a chemist from Procter & Gamble decided to come up with a chip that was uniform in shape, a saddle-shaped chip that could then be stacked and put in a cylinder and sealed. The only issue was that the process of making this uniform chip was that it tasted terrible. And so it didn't go anywhere for quite some time. It took about a decade for them to revisit this idea, and when they did, they retooled the recipe and came up with Pringles newfangled potato chips. But really, they weren't potato
Newfangled.
chips because they were actually made of a potato-based dough that was then molded into the shape of chips. And so the other big chip companies got together and put the squeeze on them, or instead they called the FDA, and the FDA said, yeah, actually, we need you to call them potato chips made from dried potatoes. Well, that isn't very catchy and probably wouldn't even fit on the can, so they decided to follow the British lead and call them potato crisps instead, though most people today just call them Pringles. Now, there was one other way that they stopped chips from breaking up in the bag, and that was to add air to the bag, which is why now, when you open a bag of chips, it's only like a third full, and that just makes me frustrated. So I don't quite understand why they didn't just start making them thicker like the ones today that I'm making. But it turns out that they did, because kettle chips started to come back in the 80s and 90s, and they are thicker and made by taking the potatoes and putting them into a kettle of oil and frying them, and they don't break as easily. So even though they do take quite a bit longer to fry, I am looking forward to my unbreakable potato chips from 1817. And here we are, the first recipe for potato chips. All right, so I've got the 1/4 inch thick and the 1/8 of an inch thick. Honestly, not a huge difference in how thick they are, it looks like. These curled up a little bit more, the 1/8 of an inch thick ones, and according to sources from the 19th century, the thinner they are, the more they will curl. But the color is pretty uniform. Let's start with that 1/4 inch thick one.
Crunchy.
Crunchy! I'm actually kind of surprised. So I gotta say, the flavor is so superior to a regular potato chip. And I love potato chips, but you just get so much more potato. It really tastes like just mashed potatoes and lard. Essentially, that's what it is. But really, really good. And they're not greasy. I thought they would be because of the thickness, that they would kind of absorb it. But let's try the thinner one. 1/8 of an inch. Here we go.
Also crunchy.
Even crunchier. And maybe a better flavor. There's almost a hint of, it's not burning, it's that Maillard reaction that kind of gives that really savoriness to it and kind of elevates the flavor. So it's not just potato and oil, it's a new flavor. But again, this is a lot more flavorful than your average potato chip that you would get today. Maybe that's why kettle chips have really made a comeback, because they do taste better. The only problem with kettle chips is that because they're more sturdy and they don't break as easily, they always cut the inside of my mouth, like the roof of my mouth. I'll eat a bag of kettle chips and regret it for the next 48 hours. But while I'm doing it, I'm very, very happy. So since we talked about some fake history here on the show today, I wanted to show you this book. It is called Fake History, 101 Things That Never Happened, by the Fake History Hunter on Twitter. I follow her. She's fantastic. She's always talking about like picking fights with people who are posting fake history online. She's great. And in this, not only does she attack some of the most common fake history memes and things that are floating around on the internet, but then she goes in and debunks it and tells you why it's debunked and what are the original sources. Where are the original sources if there are none? You know, she really does her research. It's fascinating, and she tells you how you can approach fake history as well. If it's not in this book, then you can kind of debunk things on your own or confirm them, because there's a lot of real history out there as well. So yeah, try the book, try the chips, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Alright, now I'm tempted to buy that book. Advertising works. Fake History, 101 Things That Never Happened. Tempting! A hot Dr. Pepper? What the hell? Napoleon's dinner. World War II, Navy, Thanksgiving. JFK's last meal. Oh boy. Ancient Greek beef skewers. Oh, there's so much. Cookies for a medieval nun? Sumo diet. How many videos does this guy have? Wait, what was his first video? How to make medieval cheese 4 years ago. Medieval cheesecake? Weird cures for the Black Death. Medieval brie tart. Is lasagna English? I'm pretty sure the Italians would have something to say about that. Mead? Ooh. Pumpkin pie? What? Tomb bread? Half pig, half chicken? Oh yeah, the history of pizza. I remember that. Oh man, there's so much. I want to watch all of it. History of apple pie. Forbidden flavors. Oh, decisions. Medieval ravioli. Yo, history of donuts. Let's do it.
Welcome to me.
I don't give a damn. I want my donut history. Ah, another ad. Come on. On with it.
Last night have I endured pondering what were donuts like before the hole. Well, today I'm going to find out with these donuts from 1803. So thank you to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video as we make something you do not want to miss. This time on Tasting History.
Let's do it. History of donuts. Let's go.
People disagree about a lot of things today, but one thing I feel that cannot be denied by anyone is that donuts are awesome.
I'd sell my soul for a donut.
Exactly, but instead of selling your soul, all you have to do is follow this recipe, the earliest recipe that I could find for something actually called a donut. The recipe likely comes from the mid-1700s, but it wasn't written down until 1803 in The Frugal Housewife, or Complete Woman Cook, by Susanna Carter. Dough nuts. To 1 pound of flour, put 1/4 of a pound of butter, 1/4 of a pound of sugar, and 2 spoonfuls of yeast. Mix them all together in warm milk or water of the thickness of bread. Let it raise, and make them in what form you please. Boil your fat, consisting of hog's lard, and put them in. Butter, sugar, and lard sounds delightful, especially with a nice cup of coffee, though without a hole, these might be kind of hard to dunk, even for Clark Gable.
Dunking's an art. Don't let it soak so long. A dip and flop into your mouth.
But dunked or not, the perfect way to start your morning is with a donut and your morning brew. Though, today's sponsor, Morning Brew, is not a coffee, but rather a free daily newsletter to enjoy with your coffee. See, most of the reading that I do in my daily life is about past events, like way past events, and I don't have that much time to keep up to date on what's going on in the world. In anything finance, tech, or business. You can even read it while you're enjoying your donuts. And for this recipe, what you'll need is 3 3/4 cups or 450 grams of flour, 1 stick or 113 grams of salted butter, a half cup plus a tablespoon or 113 grams of sugar, 4 1/2 teaspoons or 15 grams of dried yeast, a half cup or 120 milliliters of water, 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of milk, and 1 quart or 1 liter of melted lard or other oil. So first, mix the tablespoon of sugar into the water and then sprinkle the yeast over it. Let it sit for about 10 minutes to bloom while you work the butter into the flour with your fingertips. Then add the sugar and work it in, and then the yeast. Then you're going to add the milk, but don't add it all at once because you might not need it all depending on what flour you end up using. You want this to be a sticky dough, but you don't want it to be unworkable. Though if you do find it too sticky, you can always just add a little bit more flour. Either way, bring it all together into a dough and then knead it until it's nice and smooth. And because this is a very sticky dough, I suggest using a stand mixer if you've got one. Once it's kneaded, put it into a bowl and cover it, letting it proof for about 1 to 2 hours or until it doubles in size. Then take it out, give it a couple more kneads, and divide it up. This should make about 2 dozen donuts. You can make them smaller, but I wouldn't make them any bigger because they will be hard to fry all the way through. Then you're going to shape the donuts, but the real question is, what shape are these donuts? Because this recipe is before the invention of the donut hole, and the recipe says to make them into whatever shape you like, so clearly there were multiple ways of doing it at the time. Now, while the word donut implies that they were probably originally round, like a nut, one recipe from 1828 calls for them to be cut in diamonds with a jagging iron or sharp knife. Diamonds, squares, and stars seem to be popular shapes for donuts in the 19th century, but I am going to go with what the Virginia Housewife recommends, and that is to shape them as cakes the size of a $50. So roll them into small balls and gently flatten them into cakes, and then place them on some parchment, then cover them and let them proof for another 15 to 20 minutes while you heat your lard to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Then, without crowding the pot or deep fryer, add 4 or 5 donuts at a time. Now the fry time is going to depend on a number of factors, but I'd start with 1 minute and then turn them over and fry for another minute. Then take them out and let them drain. Now I'm using paper towels to catch all of the oil, but a 19th century German recipe says when they are cooked, place on a slice of bread to soak the fat. So if you don't have paper towels, bread might work too. Now, as we fry up the rest of the donuts, I ask you to hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History,
Like and subscribe,
allow me
everyone.
to take you through the wonderful world of donuts.
Yes, let's go. Donut history, let's
Now,
do
to
it.
tackle the history of donuts, we must first ask the question, what is a donut? Because if it's just any fried dough, we're gonna be here all day, because every country has their own version of fried dough. Funnel cake, jalebi, beignet, zeppoli, churro. And is a churro a donut? I do not think so. So we will confine our history to the round, hole-in-the-middle donut. But even to get to that, we still gotta go way back, because the donut's ancestors include things like the ancient Roman globi, which we've made here on the channel. And in the 3rd century BC, a Chinese poem talks of fried honey cakes of rice flour and sugar malt sweet meats. Jade-like wine, honey-flavored, fills the winged cups. And when Marco Polo was in China around 1275, he mentioned these exact proto-donuts that had clearly been around for 1500 years. At the same time, in the Middle East, Scheherazad's 1001 Arabian Nights mention kun fa, swimming in bees' honey, fritters, and almond cakes. And based on recipes of the time, those fritters might have been what were called lukam al-kadi, which were balls of fermented dough fried in sesame oil, then dipped in syrup and sprinkled with sugar. Starting to sound a lot like a donut to me. And over the next few centuries, those fritters spread all over the Middle East, Northern Africa, and up into Europe. Similar fritters made with apples became all the rage during Lent, and in the 14th century Spanish cookbook, Libre de Sansovy, there's a recipe for buñuelos, which at the time were egg and cheese donuts that were fried and covered in sugar. At the same time, the Germans were making a whole host of Schmalzgebackens, including one with the unfortunate name Krapfen, which is actually the ancestor of today's jelly donut. Now, one of the most important recipes in the history
Most
of donuts comes
unfortunate.
from Bartolomeo Scappi and is for an enriched leavened dough with cinnamon and raisins that was fried, then covered in sugar. And it's important because it led to a Dutch recipe for oliekoeken, or oily cakes. Today they're often called oliebollen, or oily balls. These first appeared in the 1667 cookbook De Verstandige Kok. And these Dutch oliekoeks ended up becoming American donuts because, as They Might Be Giants told us, even old New York was once New Amsterdam, and it was in New York that donuts became a thing. Washington Irving wrote about this culinary handoff in his satirical History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty in 1809. Sometimes the table was graced with immense apple pies or saucers full of preserved peaches and pears, but it was always sure to boast an enormous dish of balls of sweetened dough fried in hog's fat and called doughnuts, or oliekoeks. A delicious kind of cake at present scarce known in the city excepting in genuine Dutch families. Though Irving's history was a satire, he even wrote it under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker, so anything it says does need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but his link between the two pastries does seem plausible. Though his claim that they were scarcely known except in Dutch families seems probably not true, because oliekoeks, and by that time donuts, were popular throughout New York. Also, giving full credit to the Dutch for making the American donut seems a bit too generous, as other fried doughs like the French beignet or even the German Krapfen likely also contributed to our modern-day donut, and the name donut is most definitely of English origin, though this connection between donuts and the Dutch does seem to persist. I think it was in 1796 that Mrs. Yeroman set a table in the market to sell hot coffee for 3 pence a cup and donuts for 1 penny each. She was a large woman and reported to weigh 225 pounds, a genuine vrouw from the heights of Bergen. As she moved in the market with her broad Dutch face, the butcher boys sung out, "There goes the large donut." Kids can be so cruel.
At Ralph's,
Oh, come on.
whether you shop pickup
Back off.
1819, the donut had broken away from its European brethren and found its own place in the fried dough family. In the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving describes cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tenderer oliekoek, and the crisp and crumbling kruller. So the donut had now become distinct, but its evolution was far from over. First, when did it make the leap from the dessert table to the breakfast table? We're not exactly sure, but Henry David Thoreau wrote that in Cape Cod, at breakfast we had eels, buttermilk cake, cold bread, green beans, donuts, and tea. I, for one, am very glad that eels have fallen off the breakfast menu. Now, the other, even more iconic step was, when did the donut get its hole? See, many donuts at the time had a reputation for either being burnt to a crisp on the outside or underdone on the inside. And both the Dutch and the English had a way to get around this problem, and that was to make it so that the middle was not dough at all. Now, I fancy you wondering what a donut can be. Well then, picture to yourself a round ball of dough, quite brown outside. Now open it. Oh, there is a little cluster of plums in the middle. Plums being another word for raisins or other dried fruit. But American recipes from the time never had this for their donuts, and so American donuts were either burnt to a crisp or raw inside. That is, until Captain Hanson Gregory came along. Now this is almost undoubtedly a myth, but it is a good myth and the most persistent myth. The story goes that in 1847, Captain Gregory of Maine went out a-sailing along with some nutmeg and cinnamon donuts that his mother Elizabeth had made for him. The problem was her donuts were always raw in the center, and so he took the top of a tin pepper box and cut out that uncooked dough in the middle, making the first donut hole ever seen by mortal eyes. Though another version of his story has him jamming the donut onto one of the spokes of the ship's wheel during a storm because he needed both hands but still wanted to eat the donut. Doesn't seem likely. Also, I recently found this painting of a little girl from 50 years before this whole story, and it appears that she is holding a donut with a hole, so it really makes me question everything. But that ended up becoming the standard form of most donuts. And doing that allows the oil to get up into the center of the donut, cooking it evenly all the way through. Now I know what you're thinking. You haven't even been listening to me ever since you realized donuts don't seem a very practical food for a long sea voyage, but they were surprisingly popular on whaling ships. To celebrate the filling of the 1,000th barrel of whale oil, it was customary to fry up a batch of donuts in that oil. In a diary entry from 1846, it said, "At 7 p.m. boats got fast to a whale. At 9 got him to the ship. Men all singing and bawling donuts. Donuts tomorrow, as this will certainly make us 1,000 barrels." Now, fortunately, whale oil did not remain the most popular oil for frying donuts, because shortening was a lot cheaper and a lot easier to get your hands on. There was Crisco, and then another company called Cream Crisp, which boasted, "It will cut your lard and butter bills squarely in two." Now, Cream Crisp was only around for a short while before Procter & Gamble, who owned Crisco, slapped them with a patent lawsuit, and Cream Crisp ended up going away. And they were definitely gone by 1937 when Krispy Kreme opened its doors. And the company says that this is not the case, but I kind of wonder if there isn't some link, because how much of a coincidence is it to spell crisp and cream having to do with donuts with K's? It just seems too much. Regardless, before Krispy Kreme was serving up donuts, it was a job for the Salvation Army. During World War I, Ensign Margaret Sheldon and Adjutant Helen Purviance, in an effort to cheer up homesick troops on the front lines, began frying donuts. Originally, supposedly in the metal helmets of soldiers, and only later upgrading to empty trash cans. They would hand them out to the boys and became known as donut lassies or donut dollies. And it's fitting that they were handing these out to dough boys, which was often what the American soldiers were called, though the term has actually nothing to do with donuts. Now, while World War I eventually came to an end, the soldiers' love for donuts did not. They returned home and they demanded donuts, and the home cooks of America just could not keep up with demand. But in 1920, a Russian immigrant named Adolf Levitt invented, and this is the real name, the wonderful, almost human automatic donut machine. And it pumped out 1,000 donuts an hour in his New York bakery. Now, he was not the first person to spell donut D-O-N-U-T, but he was the first person to make it very popular, it seems. Possibly because it took up less ink, or possibly because the Yiddish word was donut, D-O-N-A-T, or it just made it easier to sound out to his largely immigrant customer base. Now, he eventually started selling the machine under a shorter name, the Display Donut Machine, and by 1931 he was making $25 million a year selling these donut machines all around the world. The New Yorker described one of these donut machines in Times Square. "We can tell you a little about the donut-making place in Broadway. Donuts float dreamily through a grease canal in a glass-enclosed machine, walk dreamily up a moving ramp, and tumble dreamily into an outgoing basket." Other than the fact that the writer couldn't come up with a synonym for dreamily, it does sound quite nice. The donut craze continued, especially after being named Hit Food of the Century of Progress at the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago.
The
And they
World's
really
Fair.
were the hit food of the century because it wasn't long before donut shops began springing up all over the country. There was Spud Nuts and Krispy Kreme, both of whom used potato in their donuts. And then there was Randy's, Winchell's, and Dunkin' Donuts. And while they became popular elsewhere, like at Tim Hortons in Canada, donuts remain a quintessentially American food. After all, who is more quintessentially American than that greatest of donut lovers, Homer J. Simpson? And I have to wonder, what would Homer think of our 2 centuries old donuts? And here we are, donuts from 1803. Now, a lot of recipes from the time say to dust them in nutmeg or cinnamon or sugar. I went with a little bit of powdered sugar, but you can put a lot of different things on them to kind of flavor them. But let's give them a shot. That's really good. So they're not as sweet as a modern donut, like if you got a cake donut or something like that. Not quite as sweet, but still has a little sweetness to it. They kind of remind me, flavor-wise, of a sweet croissant. Texture-wise, it reminds me a lot of a modern donut. Maybe a little denser, but not that much. The center, it actually looks pretty well done to me, maybe a little bit underdone. But that's why I made some that were round with a hole in it to see if there is a big difference. Yep, completely cooked all the way through. I'm not gonna lie, donuts are kind of a pain in the butt to make, but they are really, really good. And,
Yep.
you know, if you have the time and inclination, I definitely suggest you do it. Now, I did want to share with you one of Adolf Levitt, the guy who made the donut machine, one of his mottos. It was called the Optimist's Creed. As you ramble on through life, brother, whatever be your goal, keep your eye upon the donut and not upon the hole. Definitely words to live by. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History, several pounds more because you know I'm going to be finishing all these donuts.
I wonder, is he married because his wife must be like thrilled that she has like such a good cook for a husband. The wonderful, almost human automatic donut machine. Still though, the wonderful, almost human automatic donut machine. That sounds that's like a great name if you ask me. For a donut machine. Oh. Alright. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to call it here. As much fun as these videos are, I have to work later. But yeah, that's gonna be all from me for today. Thank you everyone for stopping by. Hope y'all had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you to anyone watching the VOD, and thank you as always to lovely fortune tellers watching this before I stream. Alright, let's see who's on so I can go raid, huh? Won't be here Saturday? Alright. Okie doke, let's see who's on so I can go raid. Oh, your birthday is Saturday. Well, happy early birthday. I'll be sure to give you a proper happy birthday on the day, but for now, happy early birthday. Alright, let's see here. No problem, bud, no problem. Oh, decisions, decisions. Sure. All right. Shoot, what you got? Who you got? All right, let's see here. More games live. Just gotta sit through this ad first. Alright. Let me get that raid ready at any rate. Playing Cult of the Lamb, also a friend of yours. Alright. But yeah. Once again, thank you all for being here. Remember to hydrate, rest up, eat tasty things, all that good jazz, and peace.